Thank you, Francine, for joining us again today.
Thanks for having me.
We had the privilege of hearing your story, at least the first part of your story in the United States. I'd like to hear more about how you think about trauma. In the first time that we spoke, one of the things that you said is that you work with people who've experienced trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And you provide psychotherapeutic services, but you also do body work.
There's a definition of trauma that a really simple definition of trauma that I use that helps to sort of expand what we might think of as trauma. A lot of people will say, but I haven't been traumatized. I don't have trauma. I haven't experienced trauma. And from a body centered perspective, which is the perspective that I'll be speaking from, it's not so much about the word trauma, but about what causes our systems to be dysregulated, right? What causes us to default to one way of responding always, or what causes us to have reactions that are out of our control. So the definition of trauma that I use is too much, too soon, too fast, right? So that's what we always think of as trauma, an attack, right? Something big that happens that overwhelms you. But there's two other ways that our systems can be affected. Too much for too long and not enough for too long, right? So too much for too long is like what? Too much for too long would be like living in an environment, like in a family environment that's really disruptive. Yeah. So like, one parent is an alcoholic, for example, and you never know when they're going to come home raging, or somebody is very violent in the household, or someone, this next example kind of will actually also fit both. Let's say a parent is really depressed, right? So that's a lot for a child to deal with, but that's the too much for too long. But the not enough for too long that will also come out of that situation is a depressed parent cannot really make a child feel safe. And that what children need is to be seen, heard, and understood, to feel safe and supported. And when we don't get that, that's the not enough for too long. And if so from a somatic body, I use the word somatic sometimes instead of body centered. But from a body centered perspective, if my body is not able to relax, right? Our bodies form to the habits of our life. So when a child feels safe, they can relax, right? They know somebody is going to be looking out for them. If I don't feel safe, then I'm always on guard, right? And that on guard is a physiological thing. So my body is responding as if I always need to be looking out for when is that parent coming home, right? Or always need to be worrying about how am I going to take care of this not well parent. And so our bodies, the way I hold my body, the more I do it, it becomes habituated in my system. And then there's two things. So one is that our bodies, accepted, we all accept, right, that our minds have an influence on what happens in our bodies, right? So if I'm worried about something, then I might feel like, yeah, like I feel this horrible feeling in my gut, right? Or if I'm nervous about something, then I might feel a little jittery or shaky. So we accept that. Emotions happen in the body. Emotions are actually physiological experiences that we assign a name to. The other part that is not so commonly accepted, though, or recognized, is that my brain is always scanning my body to check in with how am I doing right now. So when you think about that habit, right, let's say I'm always a little bit nervous about my safety. And so when we feel nervous, when we feel scared, we brace. Shoulders might come up, chest might tighten, right? Or when if I'm embarrassed a lot or I feel shame, then I might collapse. But this piece that I said about the brain is always checking in with what's happening in the body. So if I have this collapsed posture all the time, it's sending a feedback loop to my mind. And I'm using brain and mind here, but they're not interchangeable necessarily. Let's just say mind. It sends a feedback loop to my mind that I'm not okay. Right? And the more I hold that posture, let's say bracing, is the more that feedback loop happens. And so often now people come to work with me and they have anxiety, but their breath is really shallow because their body is really tight. The muscles are tight. And so of course they're going to have anxiety because the mind is reading the body saying, it's not okay. I'm not okay. But that's gotten habituated over time of doing that over and over and over and over and over again.
I really liked what you said. Too much, too soon, too fast. Too much for too long, or too little or not enough for too long.
Yeah. So that's neglect ultimately, right? Yeah.
And I also loved this idea of the body and the mind communicating, even if I'm not cognitively aware of it.
Yeah.
One thing that one of the reasons I appreciate it is because as I have become more cognitive, as I have been more in school or worked more in the hospital, I actually have lost touch and awareness of what's going on in my body. Yeah. So even as you were talking, I was like trying to check in. I was like, okay.
What is happening, right? Yeah. That's step one of the work that I do, is just this ability to be curious about what we call the felt sense. What is happening in my felt experience versus my thinking experience?
How do you recognize trauma in your patients or clients?
So usually by the time people come to me, they've recognized that something's wrong, right? You end up in therapy because something's not working in your life. And again, mental health is a continuum, I think. And we often think of trauma as being like the way far end of the continuum, but a lot of people live lives, productive lives with a fair amount of dysregulation going on in their system. So what I said was like, really what I look for more so is dysregulation than like, oh, this person's been traumatized. Because I think if we use that lens of dysregulation, then the stigma of trauma, like we can pull back away from that a little bit. So what do I mean by dysregulation? One of the ways that dysregulation shows up is I always go to the same response. So we may have heard of fight, flight, freeze. There's also fold or collapse. And then there's also appease, right? So I always go to fight, right? The minute and I get triggered, the minute something reminds me, and a trigger is ultimately something in the present moment is reminding you of something that was overwhelming in the past. Trauma is about overwhelm. Trauma is about my system got overwhelmed by having to deal with this thing one time big or over a lot of time. And so I learned to respond in a certain way to try to be safe. Right? Our brain's job is to keep us alive. It prioritizes life over happiness. So I always default to the same thing, right? I always freeze, or I always go into this big emotional response, or I always run away. That's one, and I don't have other possibilities of response. I find I'm always going into, so we're stuck, right? In one way of relating. Emotional overwhelm that the person feels unable to control is usually a sign that there's been some kind of overwhelm in the past that just sort of keeps repeating. What else? Dissociation. So that sort of I check out, right? I've lost like. I find that I check out into reading, or I just kind of daydream a lot, or depersonalization, right? We've talked about in mental health circles we talk about, but that's that sense of I don't quite feel like I sometimes I feel like I'm watching myself from the outside, or I don't feel like I have a sense of like being present in myself. And then some other ways it shows up is avoidance, right? I always avoid. I avoid, I avoid, I avoid. Um, I avoid discomfort. I can't handle any kind of discomfort. And sometimes that can look like procrastination. Anxiety and depression are two quick ways to know that there might be something that set that up in the past. It's not always from trauma, but and shame. Shame is a big one too that often shows up and shows up in surprising ways. So I think those are just some of the things. Relational dysregulation to like relational challenges, right? My relationships, just the same problems seem to show up over and over again in relationship, or I tend to be afraid of upsetting my partner even when they're safe. I am tracking. One of the real hallmarks of trauma is that I'm always tracking for threats in my environment, but I have a very hard time tracking for safety. Or it doesn't even occur to me to check in for safety.
One of the running themes is this idea of disconnectedness.
Yes.
To essentially manage overwhelm.
Right.
The disconnectedness from self, surroundings, individuals, emotions, to manage just the intensity that's just so hard to deal with.
The intensity that is so hard to deal with, right? And sometimes the thing that I'm trying to manage is an inner experience, right? Everything might be okay out here, but the emotion feels like too much for me to tolerate. And so I try to look for what we call management strategies or adaptive strategies or survival strategies, right? In the end, a lot of these things that we do are strategies that we formed when we were younger, when we didn't have a choice. And it's like one of the metaphors I use is like the operating system got updated, but that piece of software is still operating. It's still running as if it's in the old operating system. And so when something reminds me of something from the past, and it could be an actual reminder or an internal experience reminder, right? I go into this response that feels overwhelming. And oftentimes, it literally feels like this thing is going to kill me. It feels like I cannot survive this. I am going to die.
And, for all of those who are listening and saying, well, you're not really going to die, or, why are you overreacting? The reality is that that's the person's emotional sense.
It's not logical.
Exactly. And the emotional sense is really powerful. Mm-hmm. And ought not to just be simply dismissed.
Right. And because we are wired to survive. I was talking to my son recently and I was saying, there are very few, like life wants to perpetuate itself. Life wants to survive, and we're wired to survive. And so something that happened as an experience that you had as a child, when there was no one, like you had the adults were the ones that kept you alive, right? You couldn't survive on your own. And so when there's a disruptive environment and you learn to adapt to that environment, that is a matter of survival. And so here we are in the present context where we could survive on our own, but it's like that small part doesn't realize that that's actually the case. There's something inside of us, right? And if we even think about it just physiologically, the amygdala is the part of the brain that's tracks novelty in the environment. And sometimes that novelty has to do with safety and sometimes not. But the brain is tracking for safety and tracking for threat. And it learns from doing that, right? And so if I did something when I was 3 and I survived by doing that, now it's stored in the mind as, okay, that's the thing that I need to keep doing in order to survive that thing. And I'll often draw for my clients it's like when I'm this big and the threat feels this big, right? So we got like a 1-to-3 ratio going on here. So now I grow up and I'm actually this big, but my perception of the threat is a 1-to-3 ratio. So I'm responding as if the threat is this big because I stop checking for the threat. I just go into my survival strategy, right? I might freeze or I avoid or I start doing some work. I get really productive or I get distracted on my phone and I just spend time on my phone. So I never actually turn towards the discomfort. I just do the automatic thing of moving away from it using the strategies that I learned a long time ago. So a lot of the work of working with trauma is having some skills to shift your state in the moment. Right. And we can do that through breath, through movement, through different learned skills. And then we have to be able to turn towards the discomfort. Let me get curious. This thing that feels like I can't survive it, is that even really true?
Thank you very much. You talked about breath work and body work. The next time we're together, that's where I kind of want to shift us into, because I'm sure people are curious about what they can do, the kind of work that you do with clients. So we'll talk about body-centered psychotherapy next.
Definitely.
Time we're together.
Awesome.
Thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Flavia.